I hid them for 3 winters. That is the plainest way I know to say it, and it took me a long time to be able to say it plainly, because for 3 years the whole shape of my life was the not saying. I had 2 children on a little turf croft on a far isle of the loch, twins, a girl and a boy, and no one in the whole world knew whose they were except me, and I had run a long way and given up a great deal to keep it that way. I was a croft-fisher. I mended nets and pulled fish from a cold gray loch, and I raised 2 babies alone on an island the Gather folk thought was empty. And every summer when the great Midsummer Gather lit its bonfires on the far green shore, I kept my boat drawn up and my door shut and my children close, and I let the whole loch believe I did not exist.
If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe so the next one can find you. Stay close.
For 3 winters it worked. And then the 4th winter came in hard and early, and it tore my nets and emptied my stores, and it drove me back across the water to the one place on the whole loch I could never be seen, because there was no other place to trade for the things that would keep my children alive. And she was there, the War-Chief, the woman I ran from, the woman I never told. And across 1,000 faces, her eyes found mine, and she said 2 words, and 3 winters of running ended in a single breath. She said, "I found you." If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me back up. I want to say something first before I tell you the rest, because the way this hardened into a story on the loch is not the way it happened, and I am tired of the story. On the shore, they say the croft-fisher on the far isle stole a war-chief's children and hid them out of spite, and they say the war-chief hunted 3 winters for what was owed her, and both of those things are the kind of true that is really a lie. I lived it from the inside. I was the one who ran, yes. I was the one who hid 2 babies from their own blood. But I did it the way you throw yourself in front of a thing, not the way you steal. And the woman the whole loch calls the coldest war chief on the water is the one who spent 3 winters proving I had been wrong to run at all. But we are 3 winters and a whole loch from there. Back up, to the gather where it began, and the fire, and the night I did the one reckless thing I have ever done in my careful life. 4 winters ago I was nobody, which suited me, because nobody is safe. I was a croft-fisher's daughter from the poorest isle on the loch, and my whole world was my mother, her nets, her boat, and the small river pearl she wore at her throat that she said her own mother had pulled from the shallows the year she was born. My mother died the winter I turned 22 and left me the croft, the nets, the boat, and the pearl, and I wore it at my throat, and I have worn it ever since. And once a year, like everyone on the loch, however poor, I rowed across to the Midsummer Gather to trade my dried fish for the flax and iron and grain a person needs to live through a highland winter. That was all the Gather ever was to me, a market I could not afford to miss. I went with my head down and my prices low, and I came home the same night. I had done it a dozen times. I did not go to the Gather looking for anything but a fair trade for my fish. I have thought a great deal since about how the largest turns in a life come dressed as the smallest errands. I met her at the water stair, of all the unremarkable places. I had traded my fish, and I was carrying my flax and my little sack of grain down to my boat in the blue dusk, and the shingle was slick, and I lost my footing on the last wet step, and a hand closed around my arm out of nowhere and held me up, and I looked up to say my thanks, and forgot how. She was the chief's heir then, not the chief, and I did not know her from any other tall stranger in a good mantle, and that was the mercy of it, because if I had known who she was, I would have lowered my eyes and mumbled and rowed away, and none of this would ever have happened. But I did not know, so I looked at her the way you look at a person and not a rank, and she looked back at me the same way, a poor fisher girl dripping loch water on her boots. And something passed between us on that wet stair that I did not have a name for, and would spend 3 winters trying to outrun. She said, "Careful," and I said, "Too late," and she almost smiled, and the almost was worse than a smile would have been, and I did not go home that night. I will not tell you here what the rest of that night was, because that part is not for YouTube and because it is mine. I will tell you only that we sat by a low fire away from the gather until the bonfires burned down, and that she was not what her mantle promised. She was dry and quick and watchful, and she listened to a fisher girl talk about nets and weather as if it were the only thing worth hearing on the whole loch, and that somewhere in the gray before dawn, without either of us deciding it out loud, a line got crossed that could not be uncrossed. I did not know she was the chief's heir until the morning, when a runner came looking for her with a title in his mouth, and I watched her face close like a door as she stood, and I understood in one cold breath the size of the thing I had walked into. She was Kelda's heir. She would be Kelda's war-chief, and I was a croft-fisher with wet boots and a dead mother's pearl, and there is no story on the loch, not one, where those two things end well. She reached for my hand before she went. I did not give it. I told myself I was being wise. I rode home before the gather was properly awake, and I did not know yet that I was already carrying the two largest secrets of my life. I knew I was carrying twins before the gather fires were cold. A fisherwoman knows her own body the way she knows the weather, and I knew, and I was not afraid of that part. I have never in my life been afraid of my own children. I was afraid of what a pack does with them, because I did not go straight home and hide out of shame. I went home and I began to listen, the way a poor woman on the edge of a powerful pack learns to listen, and what I heard across that autumn froze me worse than any winter. I heard that Kelda's heir was to be bound, that same year, to a match her pack elders had chosen, a strong political binding to another pack's line, arranged and sealed by the pack's old blood law. And I heard what the blood law of Kelda said about a war chief's blood, that the heir of Kelda could not have base-born pups, that a chief's children born of a nameless croft-fisher were not heirs, and were not protected, and could, by the old law, be taken from the mother and raised by the pack or set aside entirely, whichever the elders judged. I was a nobody carrying a war chief's twins in a world whose law said my babies were either the pack's to take or nothing at all, so I did the only thing a cornered mother can do. I disappeared. I want you to understand it was not a small disappearing. I gave up the little I had. I left the poorest isle on the loch for one poorer and further, a scrap of turf and stone across the deep water where the gather folk never rode, because there was nothing there worth the crossing, nothing but a broken croft and thin fishing, and a woman who wanted not to be found. I let the loch forget me. When the twins came, in the deep of that first winter, I brought them into the world myself, on the floor of that croft, with no hearth mother and no help and no one to hear. And I have never been prouder of anything or more alone in anything in my whole life. A girl and a boy. And when I first held them and looked down and saw, even that early, even in the newborn dark, that they both had her eyes, that warm bronze brown, unmistakable, hers looking up at me out of two small faces, I sat on that cold floor and I wept. Not from sorrow, but from the sheer impossible size of what I was now going to have to protect. I named them for the loch and the weather, and not for any pack. And I swore, holding them, that no blood law and no elder and no chief would ever take them, because the only law over these two was me. And then it was 3 winters. I will not pretend they were easy, because they were the hardest and the best years I have ever had, both at once, which is a thing no one tells you about raising children alone at the edge of the world. We were poor in a way that has teeth, but we were also, on that little isle, entirely free. No pack, no law, no elder, no eyes, just me and a girl who talked to the gulls, and a boy who followed his sister into every cold shallow on the shore, and their 2 pairs of her eyes watching me mend nets by the fire every night of the world. I taught them to read the weather and set a line and be quiet when a boat passed on the far water, which they thought was a game, and which was the whole architecture of our safety. I told them their mother loved them, and the loch fed them, and that was all the world they needed. I did not tell them they had a war chief's blood. I did not tell them their eyes were a chief's eyes. I was keeping them safe. I told myself that every single day, and for 3 winters it was even true. Right up until the 4th winter came in early and hard and tore the safety out of my 2 hands. The winter that undid me came the way the worst ones do, without warning and without mercy. A great autumn storm tore my main net past mending and drove my little boat up the shingle and cracked its keel. And then the cold clamped down early, and the fish went deep. And by the turn toward midwinter, I was looking at a store of dried fish and a sack of meal that would not, however carefully I counted them, carry 3 people to the spring. I counted them anyway, every night, under my breath, the way my mother taught me, as if counting could make a thing be more than it was. It could not. I had a torn net I could not fix without new flax, a cracked boat I could not mend without new pitch and iron, and 2 children who ate more every moon, and there was exactly one place on the whole loch where a person could trade for flax and pitch and iron and meal, the Midsummer Gather, still a season off, and the small autumn trade gathers that came before it. And every one of them meant crossing the water into the world of eyes I had spent 3 winters hiding from. I sat by my fire with my sleeping children and my empty stores, and I understood that to keep them alive, I was going to have to risk the one thing that could take them from me. I was going to have to be seen. So I went back to the gather. Not the great midsummer one at first. I was not that reckless. But I found I could not make the winter work without the deep trade of the big gather. And so at last, on a bright, hard day near midwinter's end, I did the thing I had sworn I would never do. I hooded myself, and I left the twins with the one old shorewoman 2 aisles over that I halfway trusted. And I rowed the cracked boat across the deep water to the Midsummer Gather, with a load of dried fish and my heart in my mouth. I told myself I would be one poor hooded fisher among 1,000, that I would trade fast and low and be back on the water before the fires were lit, that no one had thought of me in 3 winters, and no one would look twice now. And for the first hour, it was even true. I kept to the edges. I kept my hood up and my face down. I traded my fish for flax and pitch and a little iron, and I did not lift my eyes to a single soul. I was going to make it. I was 3 trades from finished and gone. And then the crowd shifted, the way a crowd does, and opened a lane across the whole burning meadow, and at the far end of that lane, on a rise, at the High Chief's fire, stood the War-Chief of Kelda, and she was already looking this way. I told myself she could not know me. 3 winters, a hood, 1,000 faces between us and the width of the whole gather. I told myself to turn, slow, unremarkable, and walk to my boat and never come back. And I did turn. But I made the one mistake a hunted thing must never make. At the last second, I looked back, just once, just to see. And her eyes were already on mine, and they did not let go. And I watched recognition go through her, like a current through water. From the far end of that meadow, unmistakable, absolute. She knew me. She had known me in one breath from across 1,000 strangers, the way you know the one face you have looked for in every crowd for 3 winters. And I saw her whole body change, go still, then turn, then start down off the rise toward me, unhurried, the crowd folding out of her way without being asked. And I did the only thing my 3 winters of fear knew how to do. I ran. I turned and I ran for the water stair and my cracked boat, through the stalls, with my flax and my pitch clutched to my chest, and behind me, not shouting, never shouting, just carrying over the whole gather in that low, even voice, I heard her say my name, Merryn. She said it like a thing she had been holding in her mouth for 3 years. She did not chase me the way a hunter chases. That is the thing I could not make sense of then, in my panic. She did not run. She did not call the pack to cut me off. She simply came, at that same unhurried pace, and the gather itself did her running for her, because a war chief does not have to hurry through a crowd that moves out of her way. I reached the water stair with my heart tearing and my cracked boat below me on the shingle, and I got 1 foot into it, and I made the mistake of looking up the stair one last time. And she had stopped, halfway down, an arm's length and more away, close enough that I could see her face was not the cold chief's face the loch feared. It was wrecked. 3 winters of something I had never let myself imagine was written all over it. She did not come the last few steps. She stood on the wet stone with her hands open at her sides, the copper cuff bright on her forearm, and she did not reach for me, and she did not order me to stay. And she said low, only for me, the first thing she had said in 3 years that was not my name. She said, "I am not going to grab you, I have learned that much." She said, "But I am not letting go either, not this time. Tell me where you have been." I did not tell her where I had been. I could not, because to tell her where I had been was to tell her what was there, on that far isle, waiting for me with an old shore woman. And the whole architecture of 3 winters was built on her never knowing that. So I stood there with one foot in my boat, and I lied to the only person I had ever not wanted to lie to. I said I had gone up the loch to another pack, that I had made a life, that she should let me go back to it. And she listened to the whole lie with her thumb moving slow on the copper cuff, and her bronze eyes never leaving my face. And when I had finished, she did not argue, and she did not accuse me. She just said quietly that she did not believe me, and that she was not going to make me prove it, and that whatever I was so afraid of that I would lie to her on a wet stair with my hands shaking, she wanted me to know one thing before I rode away. She had looked for me, every gather, every autumn trade, 3 winters. She had walked every crowd on this loch looking for a strawberry-haired fisher who caught her on a water stair once, and vanished. She said, "I thought you were dead." She said, "I would rather you were alive and lying to me than dead and honest. Go home then if you have to, but I am going to keep looking." And she stepped back, up one stair, to give me the water. And I got in my boat. And I rowed away from her a second time, and it was worse than the first, because this time I knew exactly what I was rowing away from. I did not sleep that night on my isle, with my children breathing in the dark beside me, and the whole cracked winter still bearing down on us, and her voice going round and round in my head. "I thought you were dead." I have been looking for 3 winters. I lay awake, and I did the arithmetic I had been refusing to do for 3 years. Not the arithmetic of fish and flax, but the other kind, the kind I was afraid of. I had run because I was certain, dead certain, that Kelda's heir would be bound to her political match, and that the blood law would take my babies or unmake them. I had built 3 winters on that certainty. And now the woman I had run from had spent those same 3 winters walking every crowd on the loch looking for me, wrecked, thinking me dead, never bound to anyone that I had heard. And it was slowly, coldly occurring to me, in the dark, with my children's warm weight against me, that I had made the largest decision of 4 lives, on a certainty I had never once gone back to check. I had heard the elders' plan across one frightened autumn. I had never stayed to see if it came true. I had run so far and so fast to protect my children from a future that I had never actually confirmed was coming. And if I was wrong, if I had been wrong for 3 winters, then I had not saved my children from anything. I had only stolen their mother's whole life, and their other mother, out of fear. It was Pell who forced the next turn, though he did not know it. Pell was a gather runner, 19 and wind-chapped and kind and unable to hold his tongue, who ran word up and down the shore isles. And he had taken to stopping at my isle on his rounds because I gave him hot fish and asked him nothing, which for a boy who carried everyone's business was apparently a rare mercy. And 2 days after the gather, he beached his boat on my shingle full of news he could not keep. And the news was this, that the War-Chief of Kelda had turned the whole loch upside down looking for a strawberry-haired fisherwoman, that she had put word on every trade gather that any soul who knew where such a woman lived would be well thanked. And Pell said this last part carelessly, dropping it like a stone in still water, that everyone knew the chief had never taken the binding her elders arranged 3 winters back, that she had refused it flat, that she had told the pack elders to their faces she would take the mate she chose or none, and that the old law Elder Crannoch had never forgiven her for it. I stood on my shingle with a fish going cold in my hand and the whole ground of 3 winters coming apart under my feet. She had refused it 3 winters ago. The binding I ran from had never happened. She had said no to it the same season I had run from it. I had hidden her children from a marriage she had already refused before it was ever sealed. I want to put one thing here plainly, because I have had 3 winters to be unfair to myself about it, and I am trying to stop. I was not a fool, and I was not cruel, and I did not do it out of spite, whatever the loch says. I did the thing a poor mother does when the whole weight of a powerful pack's law is tilted against her children, and she has no one to ask and no time to be sure. I heard a danger, and I threw my whole life in front of it. That the danger turned out to be smaller than my fear does not make the fear a lie. It was the realest thing I have ever felt. But it does mean that for 3 winters, my children had a mother across the water, who had walked every crowd on the loch looking for them without even knowing they existed, and I had kept them apart out of a certainty I never checked. And now the checking was done, and the certainty was gone, and I was standing on a cold shingle holding the ruins of my one good reason, with 2 small pairs of a war chief's eyes asleep in the croft behind me. I could not unknow it now, and I could not keep hiding from it. The only question left, the one I sat with for 3 cold days, was not whether to tell her. It was how to tell a woman that the thing she had been grieving for 3 winters was not one lost fisher girl. It was 3 of us, and 2 of them were hers. I did not get to choose the how. The loch chose it for me, the way it chooses everything. 3 days after Pell's news, before I had found my courage, a boat came across the deep water to my isle that was not Pell's. A good boat, well kept, rowed by 2 of Kelda's shore scouts. And standing in the bow in her chief's mantle with her thumb on her copper cuff was the war chief herself. Pell, it turned out, was kind, but he was also 19, and a war chief who has put word on every gather that she will thank the soul who finds a strawberry-haired fisher is a hard thing for a boy to keep. He had not meant to sell me. He had simply been unable not to answer when the chief herself asked him, gently, where the hot fish came from. So she came. And I stood in the doorway of my croft with my whole life behind me in that one small room, my children napping in the warm dark not 10 feet from her, and I watched Bronwen of Kelda step out of a boat onto the shingle of the isle I had hidden on for 3 winters, and I understood that the not saying was over, one way or another, in the next few breaths. She did not rush the croft. She stopped at the edge of the shingle, an arm's length and more from me, and she looked at my face. And then, because she was not a fool either, she looked past me at the small doorway, at the 2 child-sized wooden bowls drying on the sill, at the 2 little sets of footprints in the mud of my yard. And I watched her go very still. She did not ask. That is the thing I will remember about that moment for the rest of my life. Any other soul on the loch would have demanded, "Whose are they?" or crossed my threshold to see, or seized on the proof and made it a weapon. She did none of it. She stood on my shingle with 3 winters of grief cracking open in her weathered face, and 2 child-sized bowls telling her everything, and she did not take one step toward my door. She looked at me, and her voice when it came was lower and less steady than I had ever heard it, and she said, "You have children." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "How old?" And I could not lie anymore. Not with the bowls on the sill and her eyes on my face. So I told the truth for the first time in 3 winters. I said, 3 winters old, twins. And I watched her do the arithmetic I had done on a cold floor 3 years before. Watched it land. Watched her understand in one breath exactly how old 3 winter-old twins would be, and exactly what had happened at a gather 3 winters and 9 moons past. And her hand went to the copper cuff and gripped it, and her whole body swayed once like a struck thing. And she did not come toward me. She asked. She said the only thing she asked, in a voice I felt in my own chest, "May I see them? Not Give them to me. Not, they are mine. May I see them. As if the whole of Kelda's law hung on my one word, which, standing in that doorway, it did. I let her see them. I want to be clear that it was mine to give, and I gave it, because everything that came after turned on that, she asked, and she waited, and she let it be my word, even then, even with her own blood 10 feet away. I stepped back from the doorway, and I let her come, quietly, into the low, warm dark of my croft, and I woke my 2 sleeping children the gentle way, and I sat them up in their shared blanket, tousle-haired and blinking, and I watched the coldest war-chief on the loch go down onto her knees on my dirt floor at a careful distance, so as not to frighten them, and look at her own eyes looking back at her out of 2 small faces. She did not grab for them. She did not weep out loud, though the tears came. She just knelt there at arm's length, undone, and let them look at her. And my girl, who had never been afraid of anything in her short life, tilted her head at this bronze stranger and pressed one small fist to her own collarbone, the way she always did when she was studying a thing. And across the room, I watched Bronwen's free hand rise without her willing it and press her own fist to her own collarbone, the exact same gesture, the one I had watched her make at her cuff 100 times, and neither of them knowing they had done it, and I had to put my hand over my mouth. We put them back to sleep. After, the 2 of us, which was its own strange first, a war-chief and a croft-fisher tucking a shared blanket around 2 children in a turf croft on a hidden isle. And then we went out to the shingle to talk where they could not hear. And that was where I learned what kind of woman 3 winters of grief had made her, because she did not spend one breath of that conversation on blame. She had every right to it. I had hidden her children for 3 winters. I had lied to her on a water stair. By the loch's reckoning, she could have taken them onto her boat that very hour, and there was not a soul on the water who would have stopped a war chief reclaiming her own blood. And instead she stood on my shingle in the cold and she asked me why. Just that. Why? And I told her about the autumn I overheard the elders and the binding and the blood law, about the certainty that her pack would take my babies or unmake them, about running to the furthest isle to throw my whole life in front of that danger. And she listened to all of it without once interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet a long moment, and then she said low that the binding had been real, that the elders had truly arranged it, that I had not imagined the danger. She said, "You were not wrong that it was real." She said, "You were only wrong that I would let it happen. And that," she said, "is my failure, not yours. Because I let you believe, in the little time we had, that I was the kind of woman who would let her elders choose for her." She said, "You ran from a coward. I never was. I do not blame you for running from her. I blame myself that you did not know me well enough to stay." I set my terms on that shingle, which I understand now was an absurd thing for a hidden fisher to do to a war chief with the law on her side, and which she let me do as if it were the most natural thing on the loch. I told her she could not take them, not to Kelda, not to the pack, not onto her boat, not now and not by any law, that they were mine, that I had brought them into the world alone on a cold floor and kept them alive 3 winters with my own 2 hands, and that whatever she was to them by blood, she was a stranger to them by every day that mattered, and I would not have them frightened or moved or claimed like a chief's found property. And I braced for her to remind me of the law, of what a war chief could do, of what was owed. She did not. She stood on my shingle and she took my terms one by one, and she agreed to every one of them. She said she would not take them. She said she would not frighten them. She said she would not move them or claim them or use the blood law or send a single scout without my leave. She said she would come only as often as I allowed and stand only as close as I permitted, and that if I told her to row away and never come back, she would do even that, though it would cost her more than I knew. And then she said the thing that undid the last of my 3 winters of certainty. She said, I lost you once to a version of me you were right to run from. I am not going to lose them by being her again. She said, I will earn it, however long it takes. I have already waited 3 winters. I can wait. So began the strangest and best winter of my life. She kept every single term. She came to the isle only when I sent Pell across with word that she could, and she stood only where I let her stand. And she never once, in all of it, came nearer to me than the arm's length she had held on the shingle. But she came. Through the worst of a Highland winter, across deep cold water, she came, never empty-handed, and never in a way that made me feel bought, which is a harder thing to manage than it sounds. She did not arrive with a chief's largesse and lay it at my door. She arrived with flax, and sat on my shingle mending my torn net with her own scarred hands, while my children watched this bronze giant work a fisher's knot. She arrived with pitch and iron, and spent a gray afternoon on her knees in the mud mending the cracked keel of my boat, saying little, asking nothing. She learned my children the slow way, the only way that lasts. She let my girl teach her the names of the gulls, and she let my boy fall asleep against her arm by the fire one evening, and sat without moving for an hour rather than wake him. And she looked over his sleeping head at me across the flames with an expression I had no armor left for. She was not buying us. She was courting us. All 3 of us. Slowly. At an arm's length. In mended nets and warmed keels, and the patience of a woman who had already waited 3 winters, and meant to wait as long as it took. I catalogued her that winter, the way I had once catalogued the weather, because it was the only tenderness my careful hands knew how to do, and because I did not yet dare do any other kind. I learned that the thumb went to the copper cuff when she was holding a word down. I learned that she took her own bowl last, always, after me and after both children, and that she did not seem to know she did it. I learned that the cold chief's face the whole loch feared was a thing she wore like a mantle and took off at my door, and that underneath it was a woman who laughed low at my boy's terrible jokes and listened to my girl's endless questions about the gulls as if they were matters of pack law. I learned that she had a scar along her jaw from a border fight the loch made into a legend, and that she was faintly embarrassed by the legend. I learned that she watched me when she thought I was busy with the children. With a patient wanting, she never once let cross the arm's length between us. And I learned, slowest of all, that I had begun to watch her back the same way, and that the arm's length I had set as a wall on that first shingle had become, somewhere across that winter, the last thin thing I was still hiding behind, and that I was the only one still holding it there. Dame Aldith named it for me before I could name it for myself. The way the old hearth mothers always do, sideways and without fuss. Aldith was the gather's midwife and keeper of the great hearth, 70 years old and afraid of nothing. And when the spring trade gathers began, and I finally rode across to one with my children beside me, and my hood down for the first time in 3 winters, it was Aldith who came and sat by me at the fire and looked at my 2 bronze-eyed children playing in the meadow, and then looked at me and said what no one else on the loch would say out loud. She said she had midwifed the whole loch side for 50 years, and she knew a Kelda chief's eyes when she saw them, and that half the gather knew it now too, and that I should stop thinking I was hiding anything. And then she said the thing that mattered. She said she had known Bronwen since she was a pup, that she had watched the whole loch call the girl cold her whole life, and had never once believed it. And that in 3 winters of watching the War-Chief search every crowd on the water for a dead fisher girl, she had seen the truth the loch missed. She said that woman does not want the pups because the law says they are hers. She said any chief would take the heirs the law hands her. That one has been on her knees on your shingle mending your boat, she said. She wants all 3 of you because she cannot breathe right without you. And she has been trying to prove it to you all winter at a distance, because she is more afraid of frightening you off than she is of anything on this loch. And she patted my hand and went back to her fire and left me sitting there, with my whole heart coming apart in the spring sun. I did not do anything with what Aldith told me at first, because there was a shadow across all of it that neither the mended nets nor the patient courting had cleared. And his name was Elder Crannoch. Crannoch was the keeper of Kelda's blood law, an upright cold alpha of 50 with a courteous smile and iron in his manners. And he was the one who had arranged the binding Bronwen refused 3 winters back, and he had never forgiven her the refusal. He had spent those 3 winters waiting for a way to bring the war-chief who defied him to heel, and now, in the spring, walking every gather with his horn clasps and his folded smile, he had found it, because the whole loch could see now what I had hidden, that the war-chief of Kelda had 2 base-born pups by a nameless croft-fisher, and the blood law of Kelda, the old cold law Crannoch kept, had a great deal to say about that. He began, that spring, to say it. He said it courteously, at the gather fires, to anyone who would listen, that a war chief's blood could not be base-born, that 2 pups got on a fisher girl outside any binding were by the law, either the packs to take and raise as it saw fit, or nothing the chief could ever name as heirs, and that a chief who let a nameless woman keep Kelda's blood on a far isle was unfit to hold the law she flouted. He was not, he was always careful to say, threatening the children. He was merely, he said, upholding the law. It was the coldest thing anyone said to me the whole spring, and Bronwen had not said it, and I understood at last what the arm's length and the patience had been protecting me from all along. Bronwen came to me the night Crannoch's words reached my isle, and for the first time all winter she broke her own arm's length on purpose, coming near enough on my shingle that I could see the fear in her that she never let the loch see. She told me plainly what Crannoch meant to do. He was calling for a blood reckoning, she said, an old rite, a full accounting of a chief's blood before the assembled packs at the great Midsummer Gather, the very gather now only a moon away. And everyone knew it was really an accounting of her. He would stand before the whole loch and name our children base-born by the law, and demand they be given to the pack to raise or set aside, and demand the war chief who had hidden them answer for flouting the blood law. She said his reading of the law was strong, that a good half of the packs would find it correct, and that if he made his case and I stood silent and let her fight it for me, she might lose. And even if she won it by main force of being war chief, the loch would always after that half believe that Bronwen of Kelda had bent the blood law to keep a fisher's brats. And then she did the hardest thing I ever watched her do, which was to offer me the way out and mean it. She said, "Or I can put you back on your isle tonight and swear before the pack I was mistaken, that the pups are not mine, and Crannoch's reckoning falls apart because there is no chief's blood to reckon." She said, "You go home free, the 3 of you, and no law can touch you, and I never trouble your water again," she said. "It would cost me everything I have wanted for 3 winters. I will still do it tonight, if it is what keeps them safe. Say the word." I did not sleep that night either, but for once it was not fear that kept me up. It was arithmetic, the old habit, turned at last onto myself and onto 4 lives instead of 1. All my life I had thrown myself in front of dangers, given away my own portion, run to the furthest isle, made myself small and hidden and safe, and called it protecting the people I loved. And I saw, lying awake with my 2 children breathing against me and Bronwen's offer going round in my head, that the offer was a door out of the same shape I had lived my whole life inside. I could take it. She would kneel before the whole loch and deny her own blood, and Crannoch's reckoning would collapse, and I would take my children back to the far isle, free, hidden, safe. And I would spend the rest of my life the way I had spent the last 3 winters, keeping my children apart from the one other person on the loch who would die for them, out of fear, calling it protection. Or I could stand up at the reckoning, at the great gather, in front of the whole loch and Crannoch and the blood law itself, and do the one thing I had never in my life done. Not run, not hide, not throw myself in front of the danger and disappear. Stand in the middle of it, in the open, and claim out loud, in front of everyone, the truth I had spent 3 winters burying, that these were my children and hers, and that no law and no elder got to decide whether that was allowed. And I found, near dawn, with my children's warm weight against me, that I was not afraid of it anymore. I was only afraid of not being brave enough to say it plainly. So I decided I would practice being plain. The blood reckoning filled the great Midsummer Gather to its far banner poles. Every pack on the loch came in off the water and ranged itself around the great central bonfire, and Dame Aldith stood by the fire as hearth witness, and Crannoch stood in his severe grey with his folded smile, and Bronwen stood at the head of the fire with her thumb on the copper cuff and her face like the winter loch. I stood where the accused stands, off to one side, with my 2 children held close against me, and old Aldith's steady hand on my shoulder. And I watched Crannoch make his case, and he made it well, and it was worse to hear than I had braced for, because it was not cruel. It was gentle. He walked the assembled packs through the blood law, the old clean words about a chief's blood, about binding and baseborn, about what a pack was owed of its own line, and he named it all duty, and praised Bronwen's strength while gutting her with it. And then, gently, he pointed his folded smile at my 2 children in my arms and said the packs need not be harsh about it. The pups could be taken kindly, he said, raised in the pack proper, given a name and a place the blood law could allow, which their mother on her far isle could never give them. It would be, he said, a mercy. He said the word mercy looking at my children, and every soul at that fire understood he meant to take them, and dress the taking as kindness, and do it all inside the clean, cold letter of a law that Bronwen could not simply break without proving him right about her. Bronwen moved to answer him. I watched her thumb leave the copper cuff, which it did only when she had decided to spend a held thing at last, and I understood in one breath exactly what she was about to do. She was going to take the whole weight of it onto herself, the way she had taken everything all winter. She was going to stand up before the assembled loch and either fight Crannoch's law with the raw force of being war-chief, and be forever a chief who bent the blood law for a fisher's brats, or take the other door, the one she had offered me on my shingle, and deny her own blood to make the reckoning collapse, and send us home safe and unclaimed. Either way, she would spend herself to save us, and take the cold portion herself, because that was the only way she had ever known how to love a thing, and I found that I could not let her. Not this time, because if she saved us, then Crannoch would be right about the one thing that mattered, even if he lost on the law. My children would be things that had been decided over, claimed or denied, taken or spared, by everyone, but their own mother, right to the end. And I had not spent 3 winters throwing my whole life in front of them, only to stand silent at the last, and let even the woman I was learning to love do the deciding one more time. So before Bronwen could speak, in a voice that shook and then did not, I stepped out from the side of the fire into the open before the whole loch, with a child's hand in each of mine, and I said the first loud thing I had said in 3 winters. I said, "No, let me answer him. No one is taking my children, and no one gave them to anyone. I kept them. I told them the whole of it, plainly, my way, in the only currency I have ever been able to count in, the truth, one hard handful at a time. I told them I had met the chief's heir at a water stair 4 winters back not knowing her rank, and that what happened between us was mine and not the law's to reckon. I told them I had heard the elders binding in the blood law, and had run in fear to the furthest isle, and borne these 2 alone on a cold floor and kept them alive 3 winters with my own 2 hands, and that this part, the keeping, was the truest thing I had ever done, and I would not stand here and let a man in gray call it a crime. I told them what Crannoch left out, because he did not know it and I did, that the binding he arranged had never happened, that the war-chief had refused it the same season I ran, that for 3 winters, Bronwen had walked every crowd on this loch looking for a fisher she thought dead, and that when she found my children at last, she had gone down on her knees on my dirt floor and asked to see them, and had not taken one step toward them without my word. And then I said the thing I had crossed 3 winters to be able to say. I turned from Crannoch and from his law, and I looked down at my girl and my boy, and then I lifted my eyes to Bronwen across the fire, and I said, "He wants to decide whose these are, but they were never his to decide, or the pack's, or even yours. They are mine, and I am done keeping them from you. I am choosing this, in the open, where everyone can hear me. These are ours." The gather did not breathe. And then Dame Aldith, who had midwifed half the loch and kept the great hearth 50 years, and had not said one word the whole reckoning, chose that moment to say her one word. She stepped forward into the firelight with the slow authority the young can never fake, and she told the assembled packs that she had watched Kelda's blood come and go for 50 years, and she would speak to the blood law now plainly, as hearth witness, and that no elder present had standing to gainsay her on the matter of blood. She said the law Crannoch quoted spoke of Pups got in secret and hidden from the pack to cheat it of its line, and that these two had been hidden not to cheat Kelda of anything, but to protect them from being taken, which was the opposite thing, and the law did not touch it. And then she looked at my 2 bronze-eyed children, and she looked at Bronwen, and she said the thing that turned the whole fire. She said, "And there is no reckoning to be had over whether this blood is the chief's, because I have eyes, and so do all of you. Look at them." She said, "The law does not need to decide what the whole loch can already see." She said, "These are the War-Chief's own, born of a free woman who kept them alive, and the only soul at this fire with any right to say what becomes of them is the mother standing in front of you." And she stepped back. And the blood law, which had been the coldest thing at the gather all spring, quietly came apart in Elder Crannoch's careful hands, and his folded smile closed, and he inclined his head, because whatever else Crannoch was, he was a man who knew when a reckoning had come out against him. And then it was very quiet, and it was only her and me across the open firelit ground, the way it had been across the water all winter, the arm's length grown to the width of the whole gather, and every soul on the loch watching to see who would cross it. And she did not cross it. Of course she did not. She had held that distance all winter at a cost I had watched carve her, precisely so that this, if it ever came, would be mine to do and no one else's. She stood at the head of the great fire with her hands open at her sides and the copper cuff bright on her forearm, and she did the bravest thing I ever saw the coldest war-chief on the loch do, which was to stand still in front of the whole assembled loch and let herself want something in the open and not reach for it. She looked at me across the fire, and she did not order, and she did not claim, and she did not say one word that would tip the scale for me. She only waited, plainly, to be chosen or not, by a woman she had spent 3 winters and a whole spring making free enough to refuse her. So I let go of my children's hands, gently, into old Aldith's keeping, just for a moment, and I did the arithmetic one last time, out loud, with my feet. I crossed the open ground of the great gather, and I walked to the War-Chief of Kelda, and I did not stop at an arm's length because I was done. At last, with the arm's length, I stopped in front of her, close, closer than we had ever stood in all the careful winter. And this time, no one was falling and no one was fleeing. And I took the small worn river pearl off over my head, my mother's pearl, the one thing on the whole loch I had never traded, the thing I had held through every cold night of 3 winters of hiding. And I lifted the flax cord up and over her head and settled the little pearl at her throat where mine had been, so that she would carry the keeping of it now, the way she had carried the keeping of us across a whole winter of deep cold water without ever once being asked. And I said, so the whole gather could hear it, the plainest thing I have ever said. I said, no one took them, and no one gave them, and no law here owns one hair of them. I said I kept them. And now I am choosing to stop keeping them from you. All 3 of us. I am choosing it. In the open. I am choosing you. And she reached for me at last. After 3 winters of not reaching, of holding an arm's length like a vow, She lifted her weathered, scarred hand and set it against the side of my face, her palm along my jaw and her calloused thumb at my cheekbone, careful, as if I were a thing she had looked for in every crowd for 3 winters and could not quite believe she was allowed to touch. And she brought her forehead down to rest against mine, and I felt 3 winters go out of her all at once, unsteady, and I stood in the warm span of her with my own hands come up to hold her wrists, and the whole loch and the whole cold winter fell away to just that. She set it into the space between our foreheads, low, only for me, the words she had said across the whole burning gather the night she first found me. And this time, they were not a shock, and they were not a claiming, they were a vow. She said, "I found you." And then she said the other thing. The thing that was really the whole of it, the thing the loch would make the name of the story ever after. She said, "I am not letting go. Not you, not them, not ever again." And behind us, because children do not understand held distances, or blood law, or 3 winters of anything, my girl pulled her hand free of old Aldith's and came running across the open firelit ground and collided with both our legs at once, and my boy came right behind her, and Bronwen went down on one knee without letting go of my hand, and gathered all 3 of us into the circle of one arm, careful and shaking and whole, and pressed her fist to her collarbone. And my daughter, laughing, pressed hers back, the same gesture, blood answering blood, and the whole great gather of the loch, every pack on the water, saw the coldest War-Chief of Kelda kneel in the firelight and hold a croft-fisher and 2 bronze-eyed pups as if they were the only warm thing in the whole cold north, and no one, not even Crannoch, said one word against it. There was nothing left to say. The blood had said it, and the mother had said it, and the War-Chief had said it, and that was the whole of the law that mattered. We did not go to Kelda in the end, or not the way the loch expected. Bronwen offered me the chief's high hall and the whole warm weight of the pack, and I found I did not want my children raised in the middle of the very law that had nearly taken them, and she understood that faster than I could explain it. So we made a third thing, the 2 of us, that had never been done on the loch. The War-Chief of Kelda keeps her high fire and her pack and her duty, and a croft on the near shore of Kelda water, where the deep world of the pack and the small world of the loch meet, and our children grow up with a fisher's isle and a chief's fire both, belonging wholly to neither and safe in both. Crannoch kept his blood law, and I kept my children, and we came, the elder and I, to a cold, clean peace that was almost respect. He never stopped believing the law should have decided it, and I never stopped proving to him, season by season, that a thing the whole loch can see with its own eyes does not need an elder to allow it. He was not, in the end, a wicked man. He was a man who trusted the law more than his own eyes, and had never had to hide a child on a cold isle to learn which one to trust. I had. It taught me the difference for life. The twins found out slowly, the way children take in the largest things, that the bronze giant who mended their nets and taught them to read a border map and fell asleep against the fire was not a visitor, but a mother. Their other mother, the one whose eyes they had been wearing their whole lives without knowing it. My girl took it as her due, the way she took everything, and informed the gulls of it at length. My boy simply moved his sleeping place a little closer to Bronwen's side of the fire and said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. And I watched the 2 of them fold a War-Chief into the shape of their small ordinary days, watched Bronwen learn to braid a squirming child's hair, and lose an argument to a 3-winter-old about the names of fish and carry a sleeping boy up from the shingle at dusk, with a tenderness the whole loch would never have believed of her. And I understood that the thing I had spent 3 winters most afraid of, the pack taking my children, had been exactly backwards. I had not lost my children to Kelda's blood. Kelda's blood had come across the water on its knees and asked to be let into the small, warm world I had built, and had spent a whole winter earning it. And now my children had 2 mothers and an isle and a fire and a whole loch, and I had spent 3 cold years running from the best thing that would ever happen to the 3 of us. People ask me still, at the water stairs and the gather fires, how it felt to hide a war chief's children on a far isle for 3 winters and be found at last. Because that is the story the loch tells now. The croft-fisher and the war chief and the 2 hidden pups, and the loch will tell it forever and never quite get it right. And I tell them the truth, which does not fit the story and never will. I did not hide them out of spite, and she did not hunt them out of a chief's pride. I ran to throw my whole life in front of a danger I was sure would take them, and I was half wrong about the danger. And it cost us 3 winters, and I will carry that. But the woman I ran from crossed a whole cold winter of deep water on her knees to prove she was never the danger I feared. And she never once, in all of it, reached across the arm's length I set until I was free enough to reach first. She did not claim my children. That is the part the story gets backward. She waited 3 winters and a whole spring, at a distance that cost her everything, until a woman who had never chosen anything for herself in her life chose, in the open, in front of the whole loch, to stop hiding and let her in. If you want the uncensored winter, the parts of it I could never tell at the gather and cannot tell here, the whole of what it is to be found by a woman who looked for you for 3 winters, that full chapter is waiting on my Patreon. The link is in the description. It is another summer now, a good one, a full one, and the Midsummer Gather is lit again on the green shore of Kelda water, and this time I row across to it in a well-mended boat with my 2 children laughing in the bow, and a war chief at the oars beside me, and I do not hood my face, and I am not hiding from a single soul on the whole loch. And tonight, when the bonfires were high and the trading was done and both children had fallen asleep tangled together by our fire, Bronwen sat down beside me on the warm shingle where 3 winters ago she caught me falling and I told her it was too late, and she took my hand, in the open, the way she had wanted to on that same stair a lifetime ago. And this time I gave it. And I put my other hand up and touched the small worn river pearl at her throat, my mother's pearl, that she has worn every day since I gave it to her at the same fire a year ago and never once taken off. And she pressed her fist to her collarbone, and I pressed mine to hers, blood and choice both, and neither of us let go. And I said the words she taught me, back to her at last, the way she said them to me across the whole burning gather the night 3 winters of running ended. I said, I found you.